In discussing further what was taking place in the war in the West during the First World War, the French, the British, and the Germans were going back and forth in France and in Belgium. And after the battle, the first battle of Ypres, and that's not a nickname, it's actually named a French town. It's spelled Y-P-R-E-S. After the first battle of Ypres in October of 1914, the lines stabilized, and both sides began digging in. And this began trench warfare. Now, trench warfare was not an entirely new concept, but this is what World War I is mostly known for. Trench warfare really began to be mentally invented by actually General James Longstreet, who was a Confederate general during the Civil War. He had the ideas of how to effectively do trench warfare. But what happened was both sides in the Western Front were digging in, and it went from a over 400-mile line from the Swiss border all the way to the ocean, and it happened with thousands of miles of trenches being dug by both the Germans, the French, and the British. Now, you would think that it's a long line of trenches, the way you see sometimes in the movies, but it's really not the way it happened. They'd actually dig almost like the British would actually dig almost like zigzags. Like, think Charlie Brown's shirt, the way it goes zigzag, kind of like that. Because what would happen, hypothetically speaking, if an enemy charge was successful, they came in, grabbed your machine gun. They'd be able to pretty much wipe up and down the line with the machine gun. Things like that to make it difficult for that sort of thing and trying to prevent that. The Germans' line would be a little different, almost being the shape of boxes that go up, straight, over, and down. That's how they would do it. Now, horrible conditions took place with the trenches. It was actually, both sides suffered, but it was a little bit worse on the French and British side, and that was done deliberately by the British and French High Command. What took place was, the trenches were infested. They were filthy. They were dirty. Men were not bathing. There was an infestation of lice. There were rats. Humongous rats. The rats became so big, the term became known as rats as big as cats, and this was not a joke. Rats were humongous. They were living off everything. They'd run across the men's faces when they were sleeping. And this is not to gross anyone out, but the way it would work is they would engorge themselves by eating the bodies of the men that were in a dead area of no man's land where no one can get them. And these rats would get so humongous. Actually, one soldier had an idea of bringing a cat in to see if it could solve the problem. The next day, they found the cat's bones. The rats had dogpiled it and devoured it, just to show the tenacity of these rats. Plus, they also had something called trench foot, because they were standing, the British and the French were knee-deep in mud and muck and filth, and the trenches would overrun when it would start raining, and it would fill the trenches. They'd have every problem in the world, and trench foot would set in, and that's where the feet would become so filthy and so dirty and so from being wet and covered in filth that if not treated properly, the feet would become gangrenous and have to be amputated. That happened like crazy in the beginning of the war. Now, the way it was a little different on the German side was they didn't have that problem because they built planks. They built basically boardwalks in the area, so the German soldiers were not actually in the mud. And the Germans did not punish their soldiers the same way. And plus, once the British and French overrun the lines several years later, they saw that they had nice little caves dug inside these fortifications, and inside they were actually furnished. They had chairs, they had couches, they had beds, the whole 9 yards. They were comfy. Like, meanwhile, the French and the British are over there miserable. The Germans are over there all nice and cozy. And one thing also they noticed that the German position was a little more elevated than theirs. They could see straight down on them. And so the British and French High Commands deliberately chose to leave their men in that squalor for the purpose of, hey, if they're comfortable, they won't charge and attack. They wanted their men to be as uncomfortable as possible. And the men would often have several days in the trench, a couple days out back and forth, depending on the needs of the situation. That with the constant shelling and the constant bombardments, the rats, the disease, the filth, the not knowing what's going to happen, artillery shells happening, exploding in the area, men getting completely buried alive under there. Those were some of the conditions. Sorry, the cat just showed up by my feet, startled me. And those are some of the conditions that took place in the trenches during the First World War. There you go.